Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be talking about the Progressive Era. This era took place between 1896 and 1920. Some words to keep in mind as we go through this PowerPoint are words like social reform, regulation, child labor, yellow journalism, fake news, political reform, the Keating-Owens Act, Upton-Sinclair, and corruption. I'm sure many of you have heard words like this before, including social reform, fake news, political reform, child labor, regulation. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these words throughout our presentation. On April 25th, 1898, the United States declared war against Spain. It would be the first overseas conflict fought by the U.S. It involved major campaigns in both Cuba and the Philippine Islands. The reasons for war were many, but there were two immediate ones. America's support the ongoing struggle by Cubans and Filipinos against Spanish rule, and the mysterious explosion of the battleship USS Maine in Havana Harbor. Yellow journalism was a style of newspaper reporting that emphasized sensationalism over facts. During its heyday in the late 19th century, it was one of the many factors that helped push the United States and Spain into war in Cuba and the Philippines, leading to the acquisition of overseas territory by the United States. Half a world away, and only 11 days after the war began, the Spanish Pacific Fleet in Manila Bay was defeated by the U.S. Navy in a swift strike made by Commander George Dewey. Unaware of Dewey's quick success, President McKinley ordered troops to mount a campaign against the capital of Manila. The military base best suited to stage this campaign was the Presidio of San Francisco. Volunteer soldiers from all over the United States gathered and trained at the Presidio before the long sea voyage to the Philippines. Their quest was declared as a splendid little war by Secretary of State John Hay. Ultimately, the U.S. won in August 12th of 1898. In this photo, you can see some of the examples of yellow journalism. They're circled in red. And these are some recent images of yellow journalism. So you can kind of see the sensationalism that is occurring. This happens, in political ads and things that we are seeing present as well. Here are some characteristics of yellow journalism. So a few of those are a lack of reliable sources, exaggerated content like the content you saw previously, clearly biased, eye-catching headlines, and sensationalism. So, some of the causes of the progressive movement. Vast corporate wealth and a free-based governance structure fueled widespread corruption during America's Gilded Age. By 1890, the country's 4,000 millionaires held 20% of the country's wealth, and with that enormous affluence became colossal political corruption. So some of the examples are the excesses of the Gilded Age, including income disparity, lavish lifestyles, the employment of women, the practices of robber barons. This was a person who has become rich through ruthless and unscrupulous business practices. Some of the other causes for progressive movement include the working conditions for labor, dangerous working conditions, child labor. What are some kinds of working conditions that would force you to push for labor? Take a moment and think about that. Maybe it's working too long of hours, not getting paid enough, working in unsafe environments, kind of like the environments we read about yesterday when we were talking about the Triangle Fire. Some other causes of the progressive movement include poverty in slums, so tenement houses, lack of regulation, immigrants in cities and the different ways that they were living. The lack of regulation in the food industry, the tenements, which was the houses, and the monopolistic businesses and robber barons. Many progressives came from the growing middle class. They had more money and more time to worry about societal problems than the lower class. They were dissatisfied with the industrial workers and the working conditions and corruptions that they went through. Occasionally, there were wealthy Americans, and they wanted to act good for society. Some of the progressive beliefs include industrialization and urbanization. These created social and political problems, wanted to make society work in a more efficient and orderly way, get rid of corrupt government officials like the political bosses we discussed in the previous unit, make government work for the people so it not just be the elite but be people, eliminate abuses of big businesses, so the monopolies that we were talking about. So some of the problems that arose, so political reform, eliminate government corruption, no more political machines. They wanted honest politicians. And with social reform, they wanted to create living conditions within large cities, reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, and they wanted better working conditions in factories. So ultimately, they wanted better conditions for those living in cities, for those working in factories. And in regards to political reform, they wanted to eliminate corruption. Child labor is another issue we talked about in class, and we read a little bit about child labor yesterday and the Triangle Fires with the young women working in that factory. But children often worked long hours in dangerous factory conditions, and they were paid very little, even less than the adults were being paid, who were already being paid very little. Their size made them useful to move in between small spaces, so they were doing dangerous work. They were easier to manage and control, and most of them had to work in order to help support their families. Here are some more photos that talk about child labor. There was opposition to child labor. The Keating-Owens Act of 1916 banned child labor nationwide, but was ruled unconstitutional in 1918. Then there was Hammer v. Dagenhart in 1918. And that is what overruled Keating-Owens Act. Many states passed laws requiring children to stay in school until a certain age, and many progressives began to push for school reform for children education as well. John Dewey was a leading figure in schools reform, and they wanted to teach new subjects as well as practical skills. Many of the things that you still learn in school today. Next, we'll talk about some important muckrakers. We talked about muckrakers yesterday as well. Muckrakers were the one who inquires into and publishes scandal and allegations of corruption among political and business leaders. Some examples of these are Ida Tarbell, Jane Addams, Jacob Riis, Lincoln Steffens, and Upton Sinclair. Ida Tarbell was an American teacher, author, and journalist. She was one of the leading muckrakers of the Progressive era. She helped to lead the dissolution of the American Standard Oil Company in 1904 and revealed the corrupt business practices used by Rockefeller's monopoly. Next, we have Jane Addams, known as the mother of social work, one of the leading figures in the settlement house movement. This was a community center that provided social services to the poor, such as nursery schools, kindergartners that taught English to immigrants, had certain education programs for adults as well. She also founded the Hull House in Chicago in 1889, so she did a lot of amazing work. Next, we have Lincoln Steffens. He began as a journalist and then eventually became a muckraker. He was known for investigating corruption in city governments. He published a series of articles describing Boss Tweed's corrupt practices. We learned a lot about Boss Tweed in the previous unit as well. And his publications led to the arrest of Boss Tweed and an end to the Tammany Hall politics in New York City. We have Jacob Riis. He was a muckraking journalist and photographer. Published How the Other Half Lives in 1890. You may have heard of this book before. This was a series of photographs taken of living conditions in the slums of NYC. And it was showed to the wealthy to educate them as to how bad the living conditions are for lower class Americans. And these are some of the photos that he had taken. Next, we have Upton Sinclair. He went undercover to a meat packaging plant in Chicago and wrote about his experiences. This led to the book The Jungle in 1906, which showed the unsanitary conditions of the food industry in the United States. We're going to be looking at the jungle in the next activity that we do. And this led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act. And here are some photos that go along with that as well. Next, we have the social gospel, a religious movement to solve problems of society, child labor, crime, poor working conditions, and poor schooling resulting from the Industrial Revolution. And lastly, we have a writing prompt. We're going to do an activity with the writing prompt in just a moment.